She walked into that mansion as a bride. She left it as a ghost, bruised, silenced, and erased from every dinner table, every family photo, every conversation that mattered. For months, Amani Caldwell smiled through broken ribs of dignity, while the women who were supposed to call her family called her something far worse behind closed doors. And the man she married, the most feared criminal in all of Seoul, saw nothing. Until the night he came home early, until he heard everything. If you've ever been made to feel invisible in a place you were supposed to belong, stay with me until the very end, and drop your city in the comments so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled. The morning Amani Caldwell flew into Incheon International Airport, she told herself, the tight knot in her stomach was just nerves, just the altitude, just the recycled airplane air that made everything feel slightly wrong. She pressed her forehead against the cold oval window and watched the Han River cut through Seoul below her like a gray scar, and she thought, I chose this. Nobody forced me. I chose him. She had been telling herself that for 3 weeks, ever since the wedding. The ceremony had been small by Kang family standards, which still meant 240 guests, a private ballroom on the 43rd floor of a building Taejun partially owned, and enough white orchids to fill a greenhouse. Amani had worn a gown her mother cried over in their apartment back in Chicago, in the kitchen where the linoleum still curled up at the corner near the refrigerator, no matter how many times they tried to glue it back down. Her mother had said, "Baby girl, you are going to be the most beautiful woman in any room you walk into." And then quieter, almost to herself, just make sure he sees that too. Taejun had seen it. That much Amani believed even now, with her carry-on shoved in the overhead bin and her fingers working a groove into her own palm without realizing it. Kang Taejun was not a man you misread. He was 35, built like someone who had survived things most people didn't survive, with a stillness about him that could read as calm or as threat depending on the situation. He ran organizations that didn't appear in any business registry, controlled territory that didn't appear on any map, and made decisions that men twice his age deferred to without question. Amani had met him in Chicago 18 months ago, when he was in the city on business she deliberately never asked about, at a gallery opening where his security team had stood near the emergency exits and tried to look like regular people attending a regular art show. They had failed. And Taejun had not even tried. He'd stood in front of one of Imani's paintings, a large canvas, oil on linen, a woman sitting in a doorway with her back to the viewer and one hand pressed flat against the frame. And he'd looked at it for almost 6 minutes without moving. She had timed it without meaning to. When he finally turned, he'd said, "She doesn't know whether she's coming in or going out." Amani had answered, "Neither do I." He'd looked at her then, really looked, the way people rarely did, and something in his expression had shifted just slightly, not softened, more like recognized. 18 months. A courtship that happened across 12 time zones and 47 video calls, and 3 visits to Chicago where Taejun ate deep dish pizza without complaining, and let her mother interrogate him for 4 hours, and sat through a thunderstorm in her living room reading a book while she painted, because she'd told him she needed to work, and he'd simply said, "Fine, I'll stay out of your way." He hadn't needed to fill every silence. That was what undid her, in the end. The man knew how to be still without making her feel crowded. She married him 6 weeks after he proposed. She had not met his family before the wedding. The timing, he'd said, his mother's travel schedule, his aunt's health, his sister's work. There had always been a reason, and Amani, who was not a naive woman, but who was perhaps a woman in love with a man, and therefore not seeing everything with perfectly clear eyes, had accepted each reason and moved forward. Now the plane touched down, and the knot in her stomach pulled tighter. Taejun was waiting at the bottom of the private terminal steps, flanked by 2 men who stood a careful distance behind him. He was wearing a dark coat, collar up against the November wind coming off the tarmac. When he saw her appear at the top of the stairs, something crossed his face that was close to relief, and she felt herself exhale for the first time in hours. He came up 3 steps to meet her and took her carry-on without asking. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I tried. I have food in the car." "I'm not hungry." He looked at her for a moment. "You're nervous." "I'm fine." He didn't push it. That was something she appreciated about him, and also something that later she would think about differently. That his restraint, which she had always read as respect, had a shadow side to it. A man who didn't push could also be a man who didn't look too hard at things he didn't want to see. The drive from the airport to the Kang family estate took 40 minutes through the kind of countryside that looked like it existed outside of time. Pine trees thick on either side of the road, mountains pushing up through gray cloud, the occasional tile roof visible through the branches. The estate itself appeared around a bend, and Amani saw it through the car window and felt something in her chest drop without quite knowing why. It was beautiful. Of course it was beautiful. Black stone and heavy timber and grounds that looked like they'd been manicured for decades, iron gates that opened inward, a gravel drive that curved in a long arc towards steps she'd have to climb to reach the front entrance, lit windows on 3 floors, 2 figures standing at the top of those steps. "My mother," Taejun said quietly, following her gaze. "And my aunt." Imani counted heads. "And on the left?" "My sister, Soo-jin." 3 women, standing very still, watching the car come up the drive. The word that came to Imani was not welcoming. It was assessing, like she was pulling up to a border crossing, not a home. She pushed the thought away. Nerves. Just nerves. She had flown 14 hours and hadn't slept. Everything looked like a threat when you were exhausted enough. Madame Kang Seo-yeon was 61 years old and moved like someone who had never once been in a hurry because she had never once needed to be. She was slim, immaculately dressed in a cream-colored hanbok with a high collar, her silver-streaked hair pinned at the back of her neck in a style that looked effortless and had probably taken 40 minutes. When she smiled at Imani at the top of the steps, the smile reached exactly as far as it needed to reach and stopped there. "We have heard so much about you," she said in careful, accented English. "I hope it was good," Imani said. "Of course." The smile held. "You must be tired from the flight. We will have dinner in 1 hour." The aunt, Hua Young, was younger, 50 maybe, with a sharper face and an energy that felt pressed down, contained, like something held behind a screen door. She complimented Imani's coat. The sister, Soo-jin, was 32, and she actually hugged Imani, properly. Both arms, chin briefly on her shoulder, and said, "Welcome to the family. We're so glad you're finally here." Imani held on to that hug a little longer than she meant to. Taejun's hand found the small of her back as they went inside, and for a moment, standing in the entrance hall with its high ceilings and its smell of cedar and old stone and something faintly floral she couldn't identify, Imani let herself believe that the knot in her stomach had been wrong. She was wrong about the knot. The first hour was fine. The second hour, Taejun took a call that pulled him into his private office. Business, always business. She understood that, had understood it before she married him. He pressed a kiss to the side of her head and said he'd be back before dinner. She nodded. The moment the office door closed behind him, the temperature in the room changed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a shout or a slammed door. It was simply that Seo-yeon walked past Imani in the sitting room without acknowledging her. That Hua Young's compliments stopped. That Soo-jin drifted upstairs without saying where she was going. The household staff who had been quietly present before seemed to find reasons to be in other rooms. Imani sat in a high-backed chair near the window and looked out at the garden. Bare November trees, a stone path, a pond half covered with fallen leaves, and told herself she was being oversensitive. Then Seo-yeon came back into the room. She didn't sit. She stood in the doorway and looked at Imani with an expression that Imani would spend the next 3 months trying to accurately describe to herself. It was not hatred, exactly. It was something more deliberate than that. Something that had been decided before Imani even arrived. "That necklace," Seo-yeon said. Imani touched it automatically. A gold chain with a jade pendant. Taejun had placed it around her neck himself, 2 days before the wedding, and told her it had been in his family for 3 generations. He'd said it belonged with her now. "It was given to me by my husband," Imani said carefully. "It belongs to this family." Seo-yeon's voice was the same temperature as the room. "You have not yet earned the right to wear it." Silence stretched between them. Imani's first instinct was to defend herself. Her second was to find Taejun. Her third, the one that won, and that she would later recognize as the first step in a much longer mistake, was to stay quiet, to keep the peace, to not start her marriage by creating a conflict on the very first night. She lowered her hand from the necklace but did not remove it. Seo-yeon watched her for a moment, then left the room. At dinner, there were 4 chairs at the family table and 1 set of chopsticks on a tray in the kitchen. Tae-jun was still in his office when Imani walked into the dining room and found the family already seated. She saw the table, Seo Yeon at the head, Hwa Young to her right, Soo Jin to her left, the 4th chair clearly set for Tae-jun when he emerged. And then she saw the kitchen doorway and the staff member standing in it with an apologetic expression that was also, unmistakably, a warning. "We thought you might prefer somewhere quieter," Soo Jin said without looking up from her bowl. "You must be exhausted." Imani stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room for 4 seconds. She counted them. 4 seconds, standing with her jaw tight and her hands loose at her sides and her chest doing something complicated, and her mother's voice in her head saying, "Real strength, baby, is knowing when to choose your battles." She went to the kitchen. She ate alone at a wooden prep table while the sounds of the family's dinner, laughter, the clink of chopsticks, conversation in Korean that she couldn't follow, drifted through the wall. She ate slowly, mechanically, without tasting anything. The staff member who had guided her there refilled her water once and did not make eye contact. When Tae-jun finally emerged from his office at 10:30, he found his wife sitting in the upstairs bedroom with a book open in her lap that she hadn't been reading. "You didn't eat with us," he said. "I was tired," she said. "I ate in the kitchen and came up early." He looked at her. She could see him deciding whether to push, and she watched him decide not to. "Get some sleep. Things will feel easier tomorrow." She nodded. After he fell asleep, she sat in the bathroom with the door closed and examined her wrist where Seo-yeon had gripped it earlier. She hadn't mentioned that part, the grip in the hallway after dinner, Seo-yeon's fingers closing around her wrist as she passed, and the woman's voice low and close, saying, "I hope you understand your position here." And she looked at the faint red marks the grip had left, and she did something she hadn't let herself do on the plane or in the car or at dinner. She cried. Quietly, with her hand pressed over her mouth, sitting on the cold tile floor. Then she washed her face. Then she went back to bed. She told herself it was the first night. People needed time to adjust. She was a stranger in their home. She needed to give them the chance to see her properly, to see that she was good for Tae-jun, to see that she wasn't a threat to anything they loved. She had no way of knowing that nothing she did, no patience, no grace, no silence, would ever be enough for 3 women who had already decided, before she stepped off the plane, that she was something to be removed. She had no way of knowing that the necklace around her neck would be taken from her again before the week was out. And she had no way of knowing that in 11 days she would discover she was pregnant, and that this news, which should have been the beginning of something joyful, would instead light a fuse that none of them would be able to stop. But that night, she slept, and the house around her was quiet. And in the morning, when Tae-jun brought her coffee and the winter light came thin through the curtains, and his mother smiled over the breakfast table like a woman with nothing to hide, Imani almost believed she had imagined everything. Almost. The second morning was better. That was the cruelest part, that the second morning was actually better, and so Imani let herself exhale. And that exhale cost her. Tae-jun stayed home until noon. He ate breakfast with her at the long table, and his mother sat across from them and asked Imani polite questions about Chicago, the winters, the food, whether she missed it. And Imani answered carefully, one eye on Seo-yeon's expression, waiting for the temperature to drop. It didn't. Hwa Young came down late and poured her own tea and complimented the color of Imani's sweater. Soo-jin appeared briefly, grabbed a piece of toast, said something in Korean that made Tae-jun laugh, and disappeared again. Normal. Functional. Almost warm. Tae-jun left at 12:15. His convoy, 2 black SUVs, 4 men, pulled through the iron gates, and Imani stood at the upstairs window and watched the vehicles disappear around the first bend in the road and felt the shift happen before she could even name it. It moved through the house like a pressure change before a storm, subtle, physical. The kind of thing your body registered before your brain caught up. She went downstairs to find her sketchbook. She'd left it in the sitting room the previous evening, a large spiral-bound pad, charcoal pencils, the kind of ordinary working tools she carried everywhere because the need to draw could come on her at any hour, and she'd learned years ago not to fight it. The sketchbook was on the side table where she'd left it. She picked it up and settled into the chair by the window. Seo-yeon walked in 12 minutes later. She didn't say anything at first. She moved through the room in that unhurried way of hers, adjusting a vase by 2 inches, smoothing a crease from the back of the sofa that probably wasn't there. Amani kept her eyes on her sketchbook and her hand moving, shading the curve of the stone path she could see through the window. "We have a schedule in this house," Seo-yeon said finally. Amani looked up. "I'm sorry?" "Mornings are for family business. The sitting room is used for receiving guests in the afternoon." She paused. "There is a reading room on the 3rd floor. It would be more appropriate for you." Amani held the older woman's gaze for a long moment. She was aware of her own breathing, slow, deliberate, the way she breathed when she was trying not to say the first thing that came to mind. "Taejun didn't mention a schedule," she said. "Taejun has many things on his mind." Seo-yeon's tone was patient in the way that a sharpened blade was patient. "He relies on this household to function properly so that he doesn't need to think about it. That is something you will come to understand." Amani stood up. Not quickly. She made herself move at a normal pace, gather the sketchbook, tuck the pencils. She was 31 inches from Seo-yeon, and she was aware of every one of them. "Thank you," she said. "I'll keep that in mind." She went upstairs. Not to the reading room, to her own bedroom, where she sat on the edge of the bed and pressed both hands flat on her thighs and stared at the opposite wall until the tightness in her throat loosened enough to breathe properly. She called her mother that afternoon. She sat in the bathroom with the tap running. She wasn't sure why, some instinct about privacy in a house where the walls felt like they were paying attention, and she held the phone to her ear and listened to it ring twice before her mother picked up. "Baby girl." "Hey, Mama. You sound tired." "I'm fine. I'm just adjusting." She paused. "It's a big house." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Dorothy Caldwell was 63 years old and had worked 31 years as a school nurse in the Chicago public school system, and she had a finely calibrated ear for the difference between fine and fine. "How are the women?" she asked. They're adjusting too, I think." It's only been 2 days, Mama." "I know." Another pause. "You call me if you need me. You hear me? Any hour." "I know. Any hour, Amani." "I hear you." She hung up and sat there with the tap still running and the steam starting to rise, and her reflection in the bathroom mirror looking like a woman who was working very hard to believe her own story. The days that followed developed a pattern, and patterns, Amani had learned from years of making art, were both a comfort and a cage. Taejun left each morning. The house changed. He returned each evening. The house changed back. It was precise. It was practiced. It was so seamless that Amani began to wonder in her lowest moments whether she was cataloging slights that weren't real, whether she was the problem, whether her body was manufacturing threat from nothing because she was a stranger in a strange country and her nervous system hadn't caught up to the fact that she was safe. Then Soojin locked her out. It was a Tuesday. Taejun had been gone since 6 in the morning. Imani had taken to walking the grounds after breakfast. The estate's back garden was large, half formal and half wild, and there was a section near the east wall where someone had planted persimmon trees that she found she could breathe near in a way she couldn't breathe inside the house. She'd been out there for maybe 40 minutes when the rain started. Light at first, then serious, the November sky doing what November skies did without apology. She walked back to the house and found the side door, the one closest to the garden, the one she had used every morning, locked. She tried it twice. She knocked. She went around to the main entrance and found that door locked as well. She knocked there, harder, and waited, the rain coming down in earnest now, her jacket soaked through at the shoulders. One of the household staff, a young woman named Park Ji-yoon, who was maybe 23 and always kept her eyes directed at the floor, appeared at a window on the 2nd floor, looked directly at Amani, and then disappeared from view without opening the window. Amani stood in the rain for 22 minutes. When the door finally opened, it was Soojin, and her expression was a flawlessly assembled performance of concern. "Oh no, we didn't realize you were still outside. Mrs. Lee thought you'd already come in." She stepped back to let Amani through. "You're absolutely soaked. I'm so sorry. This is completely our fault." Amani walked past her without speaking. Upstairs, she stripped off her wet clothes and stood in a hot shower until the shaking stopped. Not cold shaking, not exactly, more like the kind of shaking that comes from holding yourself rigid for too long and finally releasing. She stood there with her forehead against the tile and the water running down her back, and she thought, very clearly, that was not an accident. She also thought, he is going to come home tonight, and they are going to tell him I wandered off in the rain after some kind of emotional episode. And if I tell him the truth, his sister is going to deny it, and his mother is going to look confused, and his aunt is going to say how terrible that must have been, while meaning the exact opposite. She stood in the shower until the water went cold. That evening, Taijun came home to a dinner table where his sister told a funny story about a misunderstanding with a delivery driver, and his mother asked about his meeting, and his aunt refilled his tea without being asked, and his wife sat at the table. She had been permitted at the table tonight, and ate without speaking. He caught her eye once during dinner and gave her a look that asked, silently, "Are you okay?" She gave him the small nod that she had perfected over the past 10 days. The one that said, "Yes, I'm fine, I'm just quiet, don't worry." He nodded back and returned to his mother's question. Amani picked up her chopsticks and told herself she was protecting his relationships with his family. She told herself that was a generous and mature thing to do. She told herself a lot of things in those weeks, and she was convincing enough that she half believed most of them. The paintings were destroyed on a Friday. She had brought 6 canvases from Chicago, rolled, carefully padded, carried as checked baggage on the flight over because she couldn't bear to leave them behind. They were her best recent work, large format oils, the kind she'd been building toward for 3 years, the pieces she'd been planning to show at a gallery in Seoul in the spring. She'd stored them in the small room Taijun had designated as a studio for her on the estate's ground floor, a north-facing room with good light that he'd had cleared out specifically because she'd mentioned once, in passing, that painters needed north light. She came down on Friday morning and found Hua Young standing in the studio doorway. 3 of the canvases were on the floor. Not fallen, placed, deliberately, face down on the concrete. The other 3 were leaning against the wall with their surfaces facing outward, and Amani could see from the doorway that something had been done to them. Scored, maybe. Scratched. She crossed the room in 4 steps and turned the nearest canvas over and felt the air leave her body. It had been dragged across something rough. Brick, maybe, or coarse concrete, in long strokes that cut through the paint layer and into the linen beneath. 3 years of work. The piece she'd privately thought was the best thing she'd ever made. The one she'd been afraid to show anyone because she cared about it too much. Ruined. The floor was wet, Hua Young said from the doorway. I was trying to move them to a safer spot. I'm afraid I lost my grip. Amani stood there with the canvas in her hands and looked at the damage and then looked at Hua Young and said nothing for a very long time. These are irreplaceable, she said finally. Her voice came out flatter than she intended, not emotional, just factual. I understand. I'm very sorry. Do you understand? Amani set the canvas down carefully, upright, against the wall. She turned to face the older woman fully. Because that's not what happens when someone loses their grip. That's not the pattern the damage makes. Hua Young's expression did something. A small shift, almost imperceptible, that was not quite guilt and not quite triumph, but somewhere in the narrow territory between them. I don't know what you mean, she said. I was trying to help. Please leave my studio. A beat. Then Hua Young nodded, once, graciously, like a woman accepting a minor inconvenience, and left. Amani sat on the floor of the studio for a long time. She did not cry. She was past crying about this, or at least she told herself she was, which was not quite the same thing. She sat with her back against the wall and her knees pulled up, and she looked at what remained of 3 years of her life, and she thought about calling her mother, and couldn't figure out what she would say. That night she told Taejun the studio floor was slippery, and she'd had a small accident with some of her work. He offered to have the floor redone. Better traction, better drainage. She said that would be great. He arranged it for the following week. He never saw the canvases. She started hiding things after that, her sketchbooks. The small clay figures she made when she was anxious, a habit from childhood, her hands needing something to do. The letters her mother sent, actual physical letters on paper because Dorothy Caldwell did not fully trust email with anything important. She hid them in the lining of a winter coat in the back of the closet, the kind of hiding that made her stomach hurt because she recognized what it meant to be hiding things from the people you lived with in the home where you were supposed to belong. The rumors reached her through Ji Yoon. The young staff member had never spoken to Imani directly. had never done more than indicate directions with small gestures and fill water glasses and disappear. But one morning in the kitchen, when Amani came down early and found Ji-eun alone, the young woman had looked up from the counter and then looked back down and said, very quietly, in careful English, "You should know what is being said." Amani set down her coffee cup. "Tell me." Ji-eun kept her eyes on the counter. Her hands were very still. "The mistress, Madame Kang, she has been speaking to the senior staff. She says that you have been asking questions about the family finances, that you have been looking through documents in the master's office." A pause. "She says you married him for the estate." The kitchen was very quiet. "When did she start saying this?" Imani asked. 2 weeks ago, maybe more." Ji-eun finally looked up. Her expression was careful, not sympathetic exactly, more like a person delivering information they felt someone had a right to have, regardless of the cost. "I thought you should know." "Thank you," Imani said. Ji-eun nodded once and left the kitchen. Imani stood there with her coffee going cold in her hands and thought about how cleanly it had been done. The rumors didn't need to be true. They just needed to exist, needed to be circulating among the staff, so that when the time came, and she was beginning to understand there was a time coming, a moment these three women were building toward, there would already be a framework in place, already a story that people had been hearing for weeks, a story about a foreign woman who had married into power for the wrong reasons, a story that had been planted carefully in soil that the Kang family had spent decades preparing. She thought about telling Tai-jun. She ran through the conversation in her head, his expression going careful and still, the way it did when something required him to think before he responded. She imagined him going to his mother, and his mother's face doing what it had learned to do, the confusion, the sorrow, the gentle suggestion that perhaps Amani was having difficulty adjusting, perhaps she needed more time, perhaps the transition had been harder than any of them realized. She imagined Soo-jin putting her hand on Tae-jun's arm and saying something sympathetic about how hard it must be to watch your wife struggle. She said nothing to Tae-jun. She was protecting him, she told herself. She was giving the situation time to resolve itself. She was being patient and mature and refusing to create conflict where conflict might not be necessary. She believed this mostly. She believed it the way you believe something when the alternative is too hard to look at directly. Then she missed her period. And then she missed another one. She bought the test herself on a morning when Tae-jun was gone, and she told the driver she needed a pharmacy, and she sat in the back of the car on the way home with the paper bag on her lap and her heart doing something she could not categorize as either fear or joy, but as some compound of both that had no clean name. She took the test in the upstairs bathroom with the tap running, the way she always did now, the tap always running, some instinct for privacy she'd developed without deciding to. She sat on the edge of the tub and looked at the result for a long time. Positive. She was going to have a baby, Tae-jun's baby, in this house, with these women. She sat there for 20 minutes, not moving, her mind doing the kind of calculus that hadn't been necessary 6 months ago, running through scenarios and possibilities, and what this changed, and what this meant, and whether it was possible to feel this much at once without something in you giving way under the weight of it. She decided she would tell him that evening. She would make it private. Ask Ji-eun to set a small table in the upstairs sitting room, something quiet, just the two of them. She would tell him before dinner, before his mother had the chance to redirect the evening toward family conversation and family business and all the structures that had been built. She understood now, partly to ensure that she and Tae-jun were never quite alone. She hid the test in the lining of the winter coat next to her mother's letters. She was planning the exact words she would use when she came down the main staircase that afternoon, and found the sitting room door ajar and heard her own name, spoken in Korean accented English, from inside the room. She stopped on the third step from the bottom. Seo-yeon's voice, clear and cold. Found the medical report in her room this morning. Silence. Then Hwa-young. Are you certain? Do I look uncertain to you? Another silence. Then Soo-jin, and her voice was different from the voice she used with Tae-jun. Lower, stripped of its performance. She's been planning this, the whole time. This was always the plan. Of course it was. Seo-yeon, unhurried, settled, like a woman who had known this was coming and had been prepared. A child changes everything. He won't leave her if there's a child. He won't listen to reason. Then we move faster, Hua-young said. Yes. A pause. We move faster. Mani stood on the staircase with one hand on the banister and the other pressed flat against her own stomach. Not consciously, just the body doing what the body did, the oldest instinct there was, and she understood with a clarity that felt like cold water that she had badly miscalculated how much time she had. She had believed on some level that silence bought her safety, that patience would eventually be rewarded, that these women, whatever their cruelty, were working within some limit she simply hadn't identified yet. She understood now that there was no limit, and she understood something else. They had found the medical report, which meant they had been in her room, which meant they had been going through her things, which meant the winter coat, the test, her mother's letters, everything she'd hidden. None of it was safe. She took her hand off the banister. She turned and went back up the stairs, quietly, the way she'd learned to move in this house. Like someone who had accepted that she would never fully belong to it and had begun, without deciding to disappear into its corners. Behind her, the sitting room voices continued, low and certain, making plans for a future in which she did not exist. And for the first time since arriving in Seoul, Imani Caldwell stopped thinking about how to survive this quietly and started thinking about something else entirely. She did not go back to the bedroom. That was the first decision. Small, maybe, to anyone watching from outside, but it was the first time in 3 months that Imani made a choice based on what she needed instead of what would keep the peace. She turned on the stairs and did not go back up to the room where they had already been, where they had already moved through her things with the easy confidence of people who had never once been told no in their own house. She went instead to the kitchen, because the kitchen was the one room in the estate where she had learned, through necessity, that she had a small measure of privacy. The staff retreated when she was there, giving her the careful wide berth of people who had been instructed to neither engage nor assist. She sat at the prep table and put both hands flat on the wood surface and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way her mother had taught her when she was 9 years old and prone to panic attacks that arrived without warning and left her gasping on the floor of whatever room she happened to be in. Dorothy Caldwell had sat with her through every one of those attacks, rubbing circles on her back saying, "You are not dying. Your body thinks it is, but it is wrong. Breathe with me." In through the nose. Imani breathed. She thought about what she knew. Seo Yeon had found the medical report, which meant she or someone acting for her had gone into Imani and Tae-jun's bedroom and searched it. Not casually, deliberately. They had been looking for something or had been maintaining a practice of surveillance that had already uncovered something. The report was from the private clinic she had visited 2 weeks ago, a small practice in a neighborhood 30 minutes from the estate where she had gone alone, having told the driver she was shopping. She had paid cash. She had used her American passport for the registration form rather than her new Korean residency documentation. She had been careful. They had found it anyway, which meant the driver, or Jiyeon, or someone else on the staff she had not thought to consider, someone whose loyalty she had misread, or whose fear of the Kong women was greater than whatever neutrality she had assumed they maintained. She sat with that for a moment, the particular coldness of understanding that the ground you thought was solid had been hollow the whole time. Then she thought about what came next. Seo Yeon had said we move faster. That was not abstract. That was a timeline. That was 3 women who had spent months working methodically, now shifting into a different gear, and Imani had no way of knowing what faster looked like, what specific shape it would take, how much time she had before it arrived. Tae-jun was due home in 4 days. He had gone to Busan for a series of meetings that could not be postponed. She understood this, had accepted it, had stood in the front drive and watched the convoy leave, and then come back inside to a house that immediately rearranged itself around his absence. 4 days was a long time. 4 days was, she was now understanding, exactly the kind of window that 3 patient women would have been waiting for. She needed to tell him. She understood that now with a clarity she hadn't managed before. The fog of keep the peace and give it time finally burning off under the heat of what she'd heard on the staircase. She needed to call him tonight, tell him everything. The paintings, the locked door, the rumors, the medical report, all of it. And she needed to do it before they found another way to intercept. She went upstairs. The winter coat was in the back of the closet, pushed behind 2 of Tae-jun's suit jackets. The coat she never wore because November in Seoul was cold, but not cold enough for what she'd brought from Chicago. She reached into the lining pocket, a small rip in the silk that she'd widened deliberately, a hidden seam. and felt for the edges of paper. The letters were gone. She went very still. She pushed her hand deeper, moved her fingers along the full length of the seam, then pulled the coat out entirely and held it in her hands and felt the lining from outside the fabric. Nothing. She checked the other pocket. She checked the coat's actual pockets, both of them. She turned it over. Her mother's letters. 6 of them. Written on the pale blue stationery Dorothy Caldwell had been buying from the same shop on Halsted Street for 30 years. Gone. The pregnancy test was gone too. She sat down on the edge of the bed with the coat across her lap and stared at the closet. The hangers, the shoes lined up in their pairs, Tai-Jun's suits, her own dresses and their dry cleaning bags, and she thought very carefully about what it meant that they had taken the letters and left everything else. They could have taken jewelry. They could have taken her passport, which she had hidden in a different location that she now desperately needed to check. But they had taken her mother's handwriting, letters that contained nothing incriminating, nothing useful, just Dorothy Caldwell's voice on paper, asking how she was eating, describing the weather in Chicago, saying I am proud of you, saying call me when you need to, saying I love you, baby girl, in that careful printed script she'd developed after the arthritis made cursive too painful. They had taken them because they were not looking for evidence. They were looking for what mattered to her. They were learning what could be used. She went to the bathroom and checked the tile she had loosened slightly in the back corner near the radiator. She had told herself she was being paranoid when she did it, but she had done it anyway. Some animal part of her brain taking precautions that her conscious mind hadn't fully authorized. Her passport was still there, wrapped in a small plastic bag, pushed flat against the subfloor. She left it where it was. She didn't touch it. She reset the tile and stood up and looked at her own reflection in the mirror for a long, frank moment. The woman looking back was not the woman who had boarded the plane from Chicago 3 months ago. That woman had dark circles from the flight and hope written all over her face in a way she hadn't even recognized as hope until she compared it to what she was seeing now. This woman was thinner. Her jaw was set differently. Not hard exactly, but compressed, like something that had been under pressure long enough to change its shape permanently. Her eyes were the same, but something behind them was different, more watchful, more tired, more finished with something she couldn't quite name yet. She called Tai-Jun. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She hung up and called again. 3 rings this time, then the sound of a room in the background. Voices, movement, someone saying his name. And his voice coming on distracted, already pulled in 3 directions. Imani, what's wrong? She opened her mouth. In the hallway outside the bedroom door, she heard footsteps, unhurried, coming from the direction of the staircase, stopping outside the door, not knocking, just stopping, and staying. She looked at the door. The footsteps belonged to someone who was standing outside it and making sure she knew they were there. Nothing's wrong, she said. Her voice came out steady. She was almost surprised. I just wanted to hear your voice. I miss you. A pause. In the background, the other voices continued. She could feel him reassembling his attention, doing the thing he did when the professional and the personal collided, compartmentalizing, smoothly, in the way of a man who had been doing it his whole life. I'll be home Sunday, he said. I'll call you tonight when the meetings are done. Okay, she said. Imani. His voice shifted, dropped half a register. Are you sure you're all right? The footsteps outside the door did not move. I'm sure, she said. Go. I'll talk to you tonight. She hung up and stood there with the phone in her hand and the footsteps still outside the door, and the knowledge settling into her bones like cold. Whoever was standing in the hall had been sent to listen, to find out if she was making calls she wasn't supposed to make, saying things she wasn't supposed to say. They weren't even hiding it anymore. They didn't need to. They knew she had 4 days and no allies and nowhere to go. She crossed the room and opened the bedroom door. Sujin was standing in the hallway with a glass of water and an expression arranged into something approximating concern. I thought I heard you moving around, she said. I wanted to make sure you were all right. Imani looked at her. At the glass of water. A prop, obviously. Something to justify standing in a hallway outside a closed door. At the expression on her face, which was so practiced it had probably stopped feeling like performance to her. I'm fine, Imani said. Thank you. She closed the door. She locked it, then stood with her back against it and listened to the footsteps eventually move away. That night she did not sleep. She lay on her side of the bed. Tai-Jun's side still held the faint impression of him. which she found herself unable to look at directly, and she stared at the ceiling and went through her options with the methodical grimness of someone solving a problem that had no good solutions, only less bad ones. She could call Tae-jun and tell him everything tonight. Risk the intercepted information. Risk whatever they would do to reframe it before his convoy came back up that drive. She still had her phone, but she had to assume they had access to the records or could get them. This was the Kang household, and its reach within this property was total in ways she was still mapping. She could leave. Take the passport from under the tile, call a car she arranged herself, not the estate's driver, someone else, a public service, her phone to an app, a 30-minute drive to a hotel where she could think and breathe and call Tae-jun from somewhere they weren't monitoring. She thought about this option for a long time. She thought about what it would look like. His wife, gone. No note, no call before she left. In the narrative these women had been building for months. The unstable foreign girl, the gold digger who was never right for the family. Her disappearance would not look like escape. It would look like confirmation. She could wait. She hated that option most, which probably meant it was the most strategically sound, and she hated that too. She could wait, stay quiet, keep playing the role they thought she was still playing, and buy herself the 4 days until Tae-jun came home. She would have to be present and blank and give them nothing while she figured out how to tell him everything in a way that couldn't be intercepted, reframed, or dismantled before he'd fully heard it. She lay on the ceiling and thought about her baby. 8 weeks, the clinic had estimated. 8 weeks was still so small it barely registered as fact yet. Her body was not visibly different. She felt different only in the way of someone perpetually slightly seasick, the way of someone for whom ordinary smells had become complicated. 8 weeks. A fact that Seo-yeon now possessed and Tae-jun did not, and that asymmetry, that his mother knew about his child before he did, made something in Amani's chest go hot with a fury so clean it almost felt good. That fury was new. She paid attention to it. She chose to wait. She made herself lie there and breathe and decide to wait. And then she made herself stop second-guessing the decision because second-guessing used energy she could not afford to waste. 4 days. She could hold herself together for 4 days. She had been holding herself together for 3 months. 4 days was nothing. She was wrong about that too. The next morning they called her to the sitting room. Not a request. Seo-yeon sent a staff member to knock on her door at 9 o'clock with the message that the family would like to see her downstairs, and the phrasing, "the family would like," was doing a specific kind of work that Imani recognized but could not refuse without accelerating whatever was already in motion. She dressed deliberately. Dark pants, a cream blouse, the necklace Tae-jun had given her, and that Seo-yeon had tried to make her remove on the very first night. She put on the necklace last and held the jade pendant in her fingers for a moment, before letting it rest against her collarbone. Then she went downstairs. The 3 women were already seated when she entered, Seo-yeon in the high-backed chair that functioned as a kind of throne in this room, Hwa Young on the small sofa to her left, Soo-jin standing near the window with her arms crossed loosely, a posture that said, "I am relaxed and therefore you should be afraid." The door to the room stood open behind Imani, but 2 members of the household staff were visible in the hallway, positioned in a way that was not quite blocking the exit and was doing everything except that. On the low table in front of Seo-yeon's chair was a folder. Imani recognized it. She had seen that folder before, in a drawer in the clinic when the doctor had been assembling her results. Her medical report, printed on the clinic's letterhead, her name at the top. The positive result, the estimated dates, the follow-up recommendations. They had put it on the table so she would see it the moment she walked in, so she would understand immediately, before a word was spoken, that this conversation had already been decided. "Sit down," Seo-yeon said. Imani sat. Seo-yeon looked at her for a moment with that expression, the one Imani had been cataloging for 3 months and still hadn't fully decoded, some layering of contempt and calculation, and something that was almost not quite a form of respect, the respect of one opponent for another. "We are going to speak plainly," the older woman said. "I think that will be easier for everyone." "I'd appreciate that," Imani said. "You are going to leave this marriage. You're going to leave Korea. You will sign the papers that our attorney has prepared." A nod toward the folder. and Amani saw now that beneath the medical report was another set of documents. And in return, you will receive a sum of money that is, I am told, more than generous, enough for you to return to Chicago and rebuild whatever you had before. The room was very quiet. You will not contact my son. You will not make any claim regarding this. Seo-yeon gestured toward her own midsection, the gesture brief and precise and utterly cold. Situation. If you attempt to, we will make available to any interested party the documentation we have collected over the past 3 months, demonstrating a pattern of instability, financial manipulation, and fraudulent representation of your intentions prior to marriage. Hwa Young crossed her legs and looked at the far wall like a woman waiting for a tedious meeting to end. Soo Jin had not moved from the window. Amani looked at the folder. She looked at Seo-yeon. She thought about the words fraudulent representation, and she thought about what 3 months of manufactured rumors and planted evidence and staff members pressed into service as witnesses would look like assembled into a coherent document, and she felt for a brief and terrible moment the ground tipping. No, she said. Seo-yeon blinked, just once, as though she had genuinely not anticipated the word. No, Amani said again, more clearly, because it felt necessary to say it twice. I'm not signing anything, I'm not leaving, and I'm going to tell my husband about this conversation. The temperature in the room changed. Hwa Young stood up and moved to the tea tray on the side table. She lifted the pot with the deliberateness of someone who had decided what she was going to do before she picked it up, and she poured tea into a cup, and then she turned and poured it across the floor, a long, slow, deliberate stream of pale gold liquid spreading across the dark wood. And she set the cup down on the tray and looked at Amani and said, "Clean that up." Amani did not move. Soo-jin pushed off from the window. She crossed the room with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been waiting for this specific moment, and she reached down and took Amani's right hand off the arm of the chair. She worked the wedding ring off Imani's finger. It didn't come easily. Imani's hands had swollen slightly in the cold, and there was a moment where Soo-jin simply pulled harder and the joint bent wrong, and Imani's breath caught involuntarily. Soo-jin dropped the ring onto the floor beside the spilled tea. "Pick it up," she said. Amani looked at her ring on the floor. She looked at Soo-jin's face. She looked at Seo-yeon, who had not moved from her chair and whose expression had become something that no longer needed a name because it had dropped all pretense of being anything other than what it was. She bent forward to reach for the ring. Soo-jin's hand connected with the side of her face. Not a slap, something between a slap and a shove, open-palmed, hard enough that Amani's head snapped to the right, and her vision went briefly white at the edges, and she tasted something copper-bright at the back of her throat. She put a hand on the arm of the chair to stop herself from going sideways. The room was absolutely silent. Seo-yeon looked down at Imani from her chair and said, in a voice as level as a horizon, "A black woman will never become the true mother of a Kang heir. You understand that, don't you? You have always understood that." Imani sat with her hand pressed to her face and the taste of blood in her mouth, and 3 months of silence and patience and careful strategic restraint burning up all at once like paper. And then, from the hallway, from somewhere beyond the open door and the staff members who had been positioned not quite blocking the exit, came the sound of the front entrance opening. All 3 women looked toward the door, and then nobody moved because none of them had called for the convoy to return early, and none of them had heard the cars on the drive, and none of them had received any message to indicate that the 4-day absence had just become something else entirely. The footsteps in the entrance hall were unhurried and familiar, and they came directly toward the sitting room with the confidence of a man who owned every floor he walked on. Seo-yeon's face, for the first and only time in 3 months, showed Imani something she had never seen there before. Fear. The door opened, the way doors opened when the person on the other side had never once in their life needed to knock. Kang Tae-jun stood in the doorway of the sitting room with rain still on the shoulders of his black coat and his hair slightly damp at the temples, and his eyes moving across the room with the rapid, practiced assessment of a man whose survival had always depended on reading a situation in the first 3 seconds. He took in his mother in her chair, his aunt by the tea tray, his sister standing in the center of the room, and then his wife, sitting at an angle with one hand pressed against the side of her face and her eyes meeting his with an expression he had never seen on her before. Not fear exactly, not pain exactly, something beyond both of those, the expression of someone who had been waiting for a long time for a door to open and had stopped believing it would. Nobody spoke. Taejun's gaze dropped to the floor, the spilled tea, the wedding ring lying in the middle of it. His jaw moved, once, like something being locked into place. Taejun, Seo-yeon's voice, recovering first, already reassembling. We weren't expecting you until Sunday. There was a misunderstanding here between... Don't. His voice came out quiet. That was the thing about Taejun's anger. Amani had seen it once, in Chicago, directed at one of his own men, and it had been the quietest she had ever heard him. Quiet the way a room goes quiet when the electricity cuts out. Everything just stops. Don't say another word. He crossed the room. Not to his mother, not to his sister. He walked directly to Amani and he crouched down in front of her chair, a big man folding himself down to her level, and he looked at her face, at the redness spreading along her cheekbone, at the way her jaw was set and her eyes were dry because she was past the kind of crying that came easily. He reached up and very carefully moved her hand away from her face. He looked at what was under it for a long moment. Then he took off his coat, one shoulder, then the other, controlled and deliberate, and he put it around her. It was still warm from his body, and it smelled like rain and the specific cedar and something darker smell that she associated with him in a way she couldn't separate from the feeling of being safe, which was complicated now, which was its own kind of pain, but she pulled it around herself anyway. He reached down and picked up the wedding ring from the floor. He held it between two fingers and looked at it. A brief look, almost clinical. And then he took Amani's right hand and slid it back onto her finger. He stood up. When he turned around, the room was so still that the sound of rain against the windows was almost loud. How long? He said. It wasn't quite a question. The inflection was wrong for a question. Amani looked at the back of his coat, at his shoulders, which were very straight. Since the day you brought me here. The silence that followed that sentence was the longest silence she had ever sat inside. Seo-yeon stood up from her chair. Taejun, what happened here is more complicated than it appears. There are things you don't know about this woman, things we have documented, a pattern of behavior that we have been trying to protect you from because you hit her. He didn't turn around. In my house. You hit my wife in my house. Soo-jin made an error in judgment. I'm not talking about Soo-jin. Now he turned. I'm talking about this room, about 3 months, about every time I came home and she told me everything was fine. He looked at his mother with an expression that Amani could not fully see from her angle, but that made Seo-yeon, for the second time in 10 minutes, go very still. She was protecting you, all three of you, because she didn't want to damage what I had with my family. He paused. I want you to understand that. She was protecting you from me. Hwa-young opened her mouth. Not yet, Taejun said, and she closed it. He pulled out his phone. He made 2 calls in rapid succession, speaking in Korean, his voice level and precise. Amani caught specific words she'd learned in 3 months of living in this house. The word for attorney, the word for the senior organizational officers, a name she recognized as belonging to the man who ran the estate's household operations. He was not shouting. He sounded like someone reading items off a list. When he hung up, he looked at his sister. Soo-jin had not moved from the center of the room. She was still holding herself in that posture, arms loosely crossed, chin slightly up, but the performance of ease had cracked around the edges. Her eyes were doing something her body was trying to contradict. Tell me, Taejun said. Taejun, tell me what you did. From the beginning. While I'm still asking instead of already knowing. Soo-jin's arms uncrossed. She looked at her mother, just briefly, a flicker of something. Not guilt, more like checking which version of the story was still viable. Whatever she saw in Seo-yeon's expression told her nothing useful. She looked back at her brother. We were protecting the family, she said. Everything we did was for this family, for you. She doesn't belong here, she has never belonged here, and if you would just listen. The paintings. His voice cut across hers without raising. Tell me about the paintings. A beat. Tell me about the locked door in November. Tell me about the stories you told the staff. Tell me... And here something shifted in him, some layer of control going thin. Tell me about the medical report you took out of our bedroom. The room changed again, differently this time. Amani watched Seo-yeon's face absorb the fact that he knew about the medical report. watched the older woman calculate how much he knew, and from where and what it meant that he had arrived here already knowing it rather than walking in blind. She watched Seo Yan recalibrate in real time, which was something to see. The speed of it. The sheer practiced efficiency of a mind that had spent decades managing information in a house built on secrets. "She's pregnant," Seo Yan said, directly, cleanly, like playing a card she'd been holding. "You should hear it from me rather than from her in whatever way she had planned to tell you. She's been concealing it. She was going to use it. I know she's pregnant." The silence this time had a different texture. Amani looked at the back of his coat again. He had not turned to look at her when he said it, and she could not see his face, but she could see the line of his spine and the set of his shoulders and the very slight shift of his weight as he said it, like something settling. "I called the clinic 3 days ago," he said. "They confirmed. I have been on the road back since yesterday morning." He paused. "I was going to surprise her. Come home early. Make dinner." Another pause, barely perceptible. "Turns out I did surprise someone." Sujin made a sound. Not quite a word, more like the beginning of one that didn't find its shape. "You knew," Seo Yan said slowly. "You already knew." "I know a lot of things about my wife that you assumed I didn't." He turned then and looked at Amani, and his expression was not what she expected, not soft, not apologetic, something more raw than either of those. Something that looked like a man seeing a thing clearly for the first time and being unable to look away from what the clarity cost. "I know she has been eating alone. I know she was locked outside in November rain. I know her work was destroyed. I know she has been sleeping in a house that she was afraid to speak in." He held her eyes. "I know she called her mother with the tap running because she was afraid someone was listening." The tap running, Ji-eun, Imani thought. Not a betrayal. An act of someone choosing, at personal risk, which side of a line to stand on. She would think about that later. She would think about a lot of things later. Right now, Taijun was looking at her, and she was looking at him, and something was happening between them that had nothing to do with the three women in the room, some reckoning that was going to take longer than this moment to fully work through, but that was beginning here, in this room, in front of his family, which was perhaps the only honest place for it to begin. "I should have seen it," he said. To her. Only to her. "I didn't let myself look." She held his gaze and said nothing, because it was true and they both knew it was true, and there was no version of this moment where she pretended otherwise. He turned back to the room. The household operations manager had appeared in the doorway, a compact, gray-haired man named Director O, who had run this estate for 19 years, and whose expression right now was that of someone who had walked into a situation he had privately been expecting and dreading in equal measure. Behind him, two of Taejun's senior officers. Behind them, two of the estate's own staff members. Taejun spoke in Korean for approximately 4 minutes. He did not raise his voice once. He spoke with the deliberate pace of someone issuing instructions that were going to be followed exactly as given, because they always were. Because in the 23 years since he had begun building the organization that now answered to him, he had never given an instruction that was not followed exactly. Amani's Korean was functional now, 3 months of necessity rather than formal study, and she caught enough to understand the shape of what he was saying even when the specific words blurred past her. She heard the words for trust and estate and authority. She heard the word for account. Financial, she thought, institutional. She heard a specific phrase she had heard once before, in a different context, that she understood to mean removed from. When he finished, Director O nodded once and began to speak quietly to the officers behind him. Seo Yan had gone a color Imani had never seen on her before. Not red. Something beneath red, something that lived underneath composure when composure finally gave out. "You cannot do this," she said. "I am your mother. This house belongs to me," Taejun said. "The trusts belong to me. The accounts, the properties, the authority over this estate, and everything attached to it. I gave you access to all of it because you were my family." He stopped. "You used that access to systematically destroy my wife's life in my own home. So I'm taking it back. She has turned you against your own blood. You turned me against my own blood 3 months ago. You just didn't know I was paying attention." Hwa-young stepped forward, and her voice had lost its careful modulation, the performance of reasonableness dropping away to reveal something meaner and more honest underneath it. "Everything we did was to protect what this family built, what your father built. You want to throw that away for a woman you've known 18 months? For a child that hasn't even... Be very careful, Taejun said, about the next word you choose. Hwa Young stopped, the rain against the windows, the sound of Director O's voice continuing its quiet work in the doorway. Somewhere in the house, a door opening and closing. Your businesses, Taejun said to his aunt, are financed through 3 holding structures that route through Kang organizational accounts. As of this evening, that financing is withdrawn. Your security detail is on my payroll. As of tonight, they're reassigned. He looked at her steadily. You have property in your own name. You'll live on that. Hwa Young's mouth opened. What came out was not a word. He turned to Soojin, his sister, the one who had hugged Imani on the front steps and said welcome to the family and held her hand for photographs, and then locked her outside in the November rain and stood in the center of this room and struck her across the face. Soojin looked back at him. The chin was still up. Whatever she was feeling, she was not going to let him see it easily. Imani gave her that. She had steel in her, even now, even here. The wrong kind, used the wrong way, but steel nonetheless. Disinherited, Taejun said, formally. The documentation will be prepared by morning. He paused. You'll leave Korea before sunrise. I don't care where you go. You're choosing her over your own sister. You chose for me when you raised your hand. Soojin's chin dropped, just slightly, just enough. What about Mom? She said. Quieter. The performance was failing now at the edges, something younger and more frightened showing through the cracks. Taejun looked at his mother. Seo-yeon was standing very straight. She had not spoken since he cut her off. She was watching him with those eyes that Imani had spent 3 months trying to read, and she looked, for the first time, perhaps the only time, like what she actually was, a 61-year-old woman in a room where she had run out of moves. Mom. His voice changed, not softer exactly, more tired, like something being carried, a long time being set down. You taught me that blood was everything, that family came before any other consideration. You taught me that the name we carried was worth protecting at any cost. He stopped. And then you showed me what that actually looks like, what you do with it, what it costs the people who aren't born into it, but who come to you in good faith. He looked at her for a long moment. I have one question. Seo-yeon held his gaze. Her hands were still at her sides. Whatever she had been, whatever she had built herself into over 6 decades, she was not going to fold in front of her son. Imani recognized, despite everything, that there was something almost admirable in that. The wrongness of it didn't cancel the will it required. Did you ever, Taejun said, even once, try to know her? The question sat in the room. Seo-yeon said nothing. That's what I thought. He looked away from his mother, toward Director O. Remove her access to the estate accounts tonight. The Family Trust Authority transfers back to me immediately. He paused. She can stay in the East Wing. She is still my mother, but she does not give orders in this house anymore. To anyone. About anything. Director O nodded. Taejun turned back to Imani. She was still sitting in his coat. She had not moved through the entire proceeding, had sat with her hands in her lap and her jaw set and watched the structure of the past 3 months dismantle itself in real time, and she felt, not triumphant, nothing as clean as that. More like the feeling at the end of a very long storm, when the rain finally stops and you step outside and the air is cold and clear, and you're standing in the aftermath of something, and you are, improbably, still standing. He held out his hand. She looked at it. His hand, the same hand that had put the ring back on her finger, that had carefully moved her hand from her face to look at what was beneath it, that had lifted her carry-on at the bottom of the airport stairs what felt like a lifetime ago. She took it. He helped her to her feet. She was steadier than she expected. The coat was too big, pooling at her elbows, and she pushed the sleeves back with her free hand, and she was aware of the staff in the doorway, and the 3 women still in the room, and the rain still coming down outside, and the jade pendant at her collarbone that she had put on this morning as an act of defiance, and that she was still wearing. You need to see a doctor, Taejun said quietly. I'm all right. Your face, I know. She looked up at him. I'm all right. He looked at her for a moment, searching, like a man checking the structural integrity of something he thought was fine and had not been checking carefully enough. Then he turned to face the room, his mother standing by her chair, his aunt rigid by the tea tray, his sister in the center of it all. And he kept Imani's hand in his, and he addressed the assembled household. His voice carried the specific quality that Imani had only heard a few times before, in his most serious professional moments, not loud, not theatrical, but with a weight to it that made the air in a room arrange itself differently. He spoke first in Korean and then pointedly in English. This woman is Madame Kang. She is the mistress of this estate and the mother of its future heir. Anyone in this household who does not treat her accordingly will answer to me directly. He paused. Anyone who has witnessed harm done to her in this house and kept silent, I understand why. I am telling you now that the reason for that silence no longer exists. My protection extends to anyone who comes to me with the truth. It does not extend to anyone who carries lies on behalf of people who are no longer in a position to protect them. The staff in the doorway, Ji-eun among them, Imani noticed, Ji-eun with her eyes directed downward, but her shoulders different, something released in them, stood in a moment of collective stillness. Then Director Oh inclined his head toward Imani, then the two officers behind him. Then, one by one, beginning with Ji-eun, the household staff. Imani stood in Taejun's coat with her wedding ring back on her finger and her cheekbone aching and her stomach doing the faint, complicated thing it had been doing for 8 weeks, and she watched them bow to her, and something in her chest cracked open in a way that was not pain. She heard her own name spoken with her title. Madame Kang. In this house, in this room, by people who had been afraid to look at her for 3 months. Taejun's hand tightened around hers. She did not look at Seoyeon. She did not look at Sujin or Hua Young. She looked straight ahead, at the rain-dark window, at the pine trees bending in the wind beyond the glass, at the iron gate at the end of the long gravel drive that she had watched close behind his convoy every morning for 3 months. She was still standing, but the night was not over, because Seoyeon had not spoken since the question that broke her silence, and a woman like Seoyeon did not simply absorb a defeat. She metabolized it, converted it into something else, and the something else was almost always more dangerous than whatever had come before. Imani could feel it in the room the way she'd learned to feel pressure changes, the way animals knew before the humans did. Taejun was speaking to Director Oh again. His back was partially turned. His hand was still in hers, but his attention had shifted necessarily to the logistics of the next hour, the documentation, the transfers, the officers who needed specific instructions before morning. And Seoyeon looked at Imani across the room, not with defeat, with the particular expression of a woman who has just watched everything she built get taken apart and has already, in the 20 seconds since the last word was spoken, begun calculating what she still has left to work with. Her eyes dropped to Imani's stomach, then back up, and her mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile and not quite a threat, but lived in the territory between them, in the space where women like Seoyeon had always done their most dangerous work. Imani felt the hair on her arms rise under Taejun's coat, because she understood, with the same cold clarity that had been her only reliable companion for the past 3 months, that removing Seoyeon from the accounts and the trust authority and the formal power structures of this estate was not the same as removing her from the equation entirely. A woman who had spent 30 years building influence in a criminal organization's household did not become harmless because her son stripped her of her title. She became unaccountable, and unaccountable was something else altogether. Taejun turned back to Imani. I want to take you somewhere tonight, away from here. The coastal property. It's 2 hours, but I think... Taejun. Her voice came out very level. Look at your mother. He turned. Seoyeon had not moved. She was standing exactly where she had been standing, perfectly composed, perfectly still, with her hands folded in front of her, and her expression arranged back into something unreadable. And she met her son's eyes with the patience of a woman who understood that the person who controlled the timeline controlled everything else. Whatever you have planned, she said quietly, to both of them, to neither of them, to the room. A Kang does not beg. A Kang does not surrender. She looked at Imani one last time. And a Kang remembers. A Kang remembers. The words hung in the room after Seoyeon spoke them, and nobody moved for a full 3 seconds, and then Taejun did something that Imani had not seen him do in the entire time she had known him. He laughed, not with humor, with a sound that was short and flat and carried in it something like grief, the specific exhaustion of a man who had just heard the most honest thing his mother had ever said to him and recognized it as such. "Yes," he said. "She does." He looked at Director O. "The East Wing, tonight. No access to the main house after 9 o'clock. He paused. "And I want the telephone lines to the East Wing monitored. Every call, logged, forwarded to me directly. She will know this is happening. That's fine." Seo-yeon did not react. She had said what she needed to say, and she was finished performing for the evening. She let Director O guide her toward the hallway with the dignity of a deposed queen who understood that dignity was now the only currency she had left and was not going to spend it cheaply. Hwa Young followed without speaking. She had not spoken in some time. She had the look of a woman processing a catastrophic miscalculation, running it back through her mind, trying to identify the exact moment where the plan had broken. She would be doing that for a long time, Imani suspected. She would never find the moment, because the moment had been before she arrived. It had been the decision itself, the fundamental miscalculation of believing that Taijun's blind spots were permanent rather than temporary. That the right application of pressure at the right time could reshape what a man saw when he looked at his own house. Soo-jin left last. At the doorway she stopped and turned, and she looked at Imani with an expression that was the most unguarded thing Imani had ever seen on her face. Not apology, nothing as simple or as cheap as that. Something more complicated. The expression of someone who had done real harm and was now, in the immediate aftermath, looking at the person they had harmed and being forced to see them clearly for the first time. What Soo-jin did with that clarity going forward was her own problem to solve. But Imani held her gaze for the 3 seconds it lasted, and she did not look away. And she did not offer anything to make it easier, and then Soo-jin turned and walked out of the room, and the sound of her footsteps faded down the corridor toward the East Wing. Tae-jun stood in the empty sitting room and looked at the spilled tea drying on the floor and the upended cup and the chair his mother had occupied and the window where his sister had stood, and his face did something private and complicated that Imani watched without trying to read. She had learned over 18 months that there were things that happened inside this man that he needed to process alone before he could bring them out into shared air. She had loved that about him once. The depth of it. The evidence of a genuine interior life in a man whose exterior was all controlled surface. She still believed in it. She was just no longer willing to let it be used as a reason for her to disappear. "Tae-jun," she said. He turned. "I need to sit down. Somewhere else. Not this room." He crossed to her immediately, his hand finding the small of her back, and she let him guide her out of the sitting room and down the corridor toward the kitchen. Neutral ground. Her ground in a way, the room she had learned to breathe in, and he pulled out a chair at the prep table and she sat, and he sat across from her. No coat now, his shirt sleeves still damp at the shoulders from the rain. They looked at each other across the wooden table. The kitchen was warm. Someone had left the stove's pilot light on, and the room held the faint residual heat of the evening meal, and outside the window the rain continued its indifferent work against the glass. And somewhere in the east wing of the house, 3 women were settling into whatever the first night of a diminished life felt like. "How much do you know?" Imani said. Not a question. More like the beginning of a map she needed him to draw. "More than I let you see," he said. "Not enough, not soon enough." He put both hands flat on the table, looking at them like they were something he was considering. "Ji-eun contacted one of my officers 6 weeks ago. Not through official channels, through a private number she'd found somehow. She gave a partial account, enough that I started paying attention differently." He paused. "I should have started paying attention differently the day I brought you here. I didn't need Ji-eun to tell me my mother." "Then why didn't you?" It was the question, the real one, under everything else. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Imani felt the familiar instinct rise in her, smooth it over, give him an exit, protect the peace. And she recognized it, and she let it pass without acting on it. She was done acting on that instinct. "Because I have spent my entire life," he said finally, "building things that would make my family safe. My mother, my sister, my aunt. I built an organization, and I grew it into something that meant no one could touch them. And I think—" He stopped, tried again. "I think I needed to believe that in return, they were, what I believed they were. Good. Fundamentally good. Even if hard. Even if complicated. He looked up from his hands to her face. Accepting that they weren't meant, accepting that everything I built the past 15 years was built on something false. Amani looked at him. At the exhaustion in his face, not tonight's exhaustion, something older, the kind that lives in a person's bones. You built it for yourself, too, she said. Not just for them. A beat. Yes. That's not the same as it being false. He looked at her. You can build something real for the wrong reasons, she said. That doesn't make the thing itself wrong. It makes the reasons wrong. Those are different problems. He stared at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite name. Recognition, maybe. The specific recognition of hearing a true thing said plainly by someone who had earned the right to say it. I left you alone in this house, he said. For 3 months. I left you alone with them and I told myself you were fine because I told you I was fine. You shouldn't have had to protect me from the truth about my own family. No, she agreed. I shouldn't have. She held his gaze. And you shouldn't have made me feel like the truth would cost more than the silence. That's not something you did deliberately, but it's something you did. He absorbed that. She watched him take it in and not deflect it, not qualify it, not reduce it. He sat with it the way you sit with something that has real weight. I know, he said. I need you to know it the way that changes things, not the way that becomes an apology and then goes back to normal. I understand. I'm not sure you do yet. I'm not saying that to hurt you. I'm saying it because I think it's going to take longer than tonight, and I need you to know I'm going to need you to keep knowing it. He nodded, slowly. The nod of a man making a commitment he understood was not symbolic. They sat in the kitchen for another hour. They did not talk the entire time. Some of it was silence, the functional kind. The kind between two people who are processing separately but don't need to do it in different rooms. Taejun got up at some point and made tea, moving around the kitchen with the slight awkwardness of a man who didn't cook but understood the basic architecture of the task, and he set a cup in front of her and sat back down. She drank it. He watched her drink it with an attentiveness that was not surveillance, but something older. The specific attention of someone who needs to verify with their own eyes that another person is physically present and intact. She let him look. It was the least she could do. Later, past midnight, the rain finally easing, Tae-jun had a second phone call with Director Oh and then a longer call with the family's lead attorney. And Amani sat at the prep table and listened to the shape of it without following the content, the methodical legal demolition of 3 women's access to 3 decades of accumulated power. And she thought about her mother's letters that were somewhere in this house now, in someone's possession. And she thought about the paintings that couldn't be recovered. And she thought about the 22 minutes she had stood in November rain and the young woman at the second-floor window who had looked at her and then looked away. When he came back, she said, I want Ji-eun to have a raise, a significant one. And I want it to come through official channels, documented, in a way that makes clear it's for service to this household, and not under anyone else's authority to revoke. He looked at her. Done. I want the staff addressed properly, not through Director O, you directly, to all of them together. What you said tonight was a start, but I want it said again in daylight when the emergency is over and it doesn't feel like an order given under pressure. I'll do it tomorrow morning. She looked at her teacup. I want to leave this house. A pause. I know. Not permanently, not yet. But I can't sleep here tonight. I can't sleep in that bedroom knowing they were in it. The coastal property, he said. I'll have it open tonight. We can leave within the hour. She nodded. They left before 1 in the morning, Amani in the passenger seat of a single car. Not the convoy, just one car, just a driver, Tae-jun in the seat beside her with his hand on the armrest between them. Near her hand but not taking it, leaving the choice to her. She looked at the iron gate opening as they pulled through it, and she thought about every morning she had stood at the window and watched it close. She thought about how a gate is both a protection and a trap, depending on which side of it you're standing on and who controls the mechanism. She put her hand over his on the armrest. He turned his hand over and held hers. The coastal property was a different world. It was smaller than the estate. Deliberately, she would later understand, a place Tae-jun had built for himself years ago, before the organization had grown to the scale that required the formal grandeur of the family estate. A place where he had occasionally gone to remember what it felt like to be a person rather than an institution. It sat on a hillside above the water, surrounded by pine trees that bent permanently toward the sea from years of coastal wind. And when they arrived and the driver opened the car door, the first thing Amani heard was the ocean. She stood in the driveway for a moment just listening. She couldn't remember the last time she had stood somewhere and simply listened without monitoring the sounds for threat. The house was opened and warmed by the time they came inside. Taejun had called ahead. And it smelled like pine and salt and slightly like a house that had been closed for a season, an honest smell, the smell of a place that existed without performance. She walked through the main room and found the wall of windows facing the water and stood in front of them and looked at the sea in the dark, the white lines of waves just visible in the distance, the moon intermittent behind moving cloud. Taejun came and stood beside her. They stood there for a while without speaking. It occurred to Amani that this was the first time in 3 months she had stood somewhere beside him without calculating whether someone was watching, without running the quiet background analysis of threat that had become as automatic as breathing over the past 12 weeks. She became aware of the absence of it, the way you become aware of a sound only when it stops. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "I almost called you that night. In the kitchen, after I heard them in the sitting room. I had the phone in my hand." "Why didn't you?" She thought about it, tried to find the honest answer rather than the flattering one. "Because I was still thinking about how to protect you from it. Even then. Even after everything." She paused. "That's something I have to work out in myself. Why I kept choosing your comfort over my own safety. That's not all on you. Some of it is mine to fix." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't want you to ever do that again." "I know. I mean it as I'm not asking you to protect me from hard things. I want to be the person you call." "I know," she said again. "But wanting to be that person and being that person are two different things. I need to see it." She looked at him. "I'll tell you when I see it." He held her gaze. "Fair." She looked back at the water. "I'm keeping the necklace," she said. He blinked. And then something happened on his face that was the closest she had seen him come to an unguarded smile in weeks. Brief, real, there, and gone. "I never asked you to take it off. Your mother did." "My mother," he said, "was wrong about a great many things." They slept in separate rooms that night. Not because of anger. She told him that clearly, because she had learned the cost of leaving things unsaid, but because she needed space around her body that was hers alone, needed to feel the dimensions of a room that no one had been through, needed to sleep without the specific weight of the estate's history in the mattress beneath her. He understood. He showed her to a room at the end of the hall with a window facing the water and clean linens and a lock on the door that she did not use but that she noticed was there. And he said goodnight from the doorway, and she said goodnight, and she slept for 9 hours straight and dreamed about Chicago. The weeks that followed were not easy. She had not expected them to be. Taejun spoke to the staff the next morning, as promised, gathered in the estate's main hall. She was not present for it, having stayed at the coastal house, but Ji-eun called her that evening on a number Taejun had made sure she had. And Ji-eun reported that he had spoken for 20 minutes, and that 3 staff members had come forward afterward with specific accounts of things they had witnessed over the past 3 months. Ji-eun's voice on the phone was different. She spoke at full volume. She did not hurry. She used Amani's title with the ease of someone who had been waiting to use it correctly. Amani thanked her, properly, with her full name. There was a pause on the line, and then Ji-eun said very quietly, "I'm sorry I couldn't do more sooner." "You did enough," Amani said. "You did it when it counted." Hwa-young left within the week. Her businesses, without the Kong financing that had underwritten them for 11 years, were not viable in their current form, and she did not have the liquidity or the connections to restructure them independently. She went to Jeju Island, where she had property, and she did not contact Taejun or Imani. Whether she ever would was a question Imani carried for a while and then set down, because she could not spend energy she needed elsewhere on the future behavior of a woman who was no longer in a position to harm her. Soo-jin went to Japan. This Imani learned through Taejun, who learned it through his organization's standard monitoring of people who had been removed from the family's trust structures. Soo-jin had friends in Tokyo, a world she'd maintained separately from the family for years that none of them had known about. She did not reach out. Imani did not expect her to, and was not certain what she would do if she did. Forgiveness was a thing she understood intellectually as a process, not an event. Her mother had told her that once, years ago, in the context of something smaller and less consequential, and she had not fully understood it then. She was beginning to understand it now. Seoyeon remained in the East Wing. This was the hardest thing, and Taejun knew it was the hardest thing, and he did not pretend otherwise. He visited his mother twice a week. He told Imani each time he went and each time he came back, not as confession, but as information. This is what I'm doing, this is what was said, this is what it cost me. He did not ask Imani to see her. He did not suggest reconciliation on any timeline. He simply maintained the thread between himself and his mother with the grim fidelity of a man who understood that cutting it entirely would leave a wound that wouldn't close, and who had decided that a limited, controlled connection was preferable to an amputation he'd regret. Imani watched this and said nothing, which was its own kind of progress, because the nothing she said now was chosen, a considered silence rather than a survival strategy. She was learning the difference. 3 months after the night in the sitting room, Taejun brought her a document. He spread it on the kitchen table of the coastal house. Their kitchen now, the kitchen she had stocked herself, and where she had spent 3 months eating breakfast while looking at the sea and regaining something she hadn't known she'd lost until it started coming back. The document was a charter for a foundation. She read it slowly, carefully, the way she read everything important. The Kong Foundation for Women and Immigrant Families, funded by the divestment of the 3 most overtly coercive divisions of the organization, the protection and extortion operations that had generated consistent revenue for 14 years. The foundation would provide legal assistance, emergency housing, and financial support to women facing discrimination, abuse, and displacement, with a particular focus on immigrant women navigating systems designed to disorient them. She looked up from the document. "This is real," she said. Not a question. "The legal structure is already filed. The funding transfers begin next month." He paused. "I'm not going to pretend I'm becoming someone different. The rest of the organization doesn't disappear, but these parts," he touched the document, "I don't need them. And they cause harm I can stop causing." She looked at the charter, at the language in the mission statement, which was plain and direct and did not use any of the elegant euphemisms that legal documents usually preferred for things that were actually about power. "Who wrote this?" she asked. "I did, with the attorney, but the—" He paused, looking for the right word. "The description of what it's for, why it matters. I wrote that part myself." She read that section again. It was 12 sentences. It described, without flourish, the specific mechanics of how institutional power crushes individual dignity, how isolation functions, how the absence of witnesses enables harm, how silence gets manufactured and then mistaken for consent. It was not the language of someone who had read about these things. It was the language of someone who had watched them happen and would spend the rest of his life knowing he had watched too long before he looked directly. She set the document down. "It's a start," she said. "Yes. It needs an actual director, someone who knows this work, not a figurehead." "I know. I was hoping you might—" "No." She said it gently but without hesitation. "Not me. I'm not the right person to run it, and it shouldn't be run by your wife. It should be run by someone with independence from this family, someone with their own credibility, their own network." She paused. "I'll help you find them. I know people in Chicago who do this work." He nodded. She looked out the window at the water. The sea in winter was a different animal from the sea in the other seasons, gray and heavy and working without rest. She had grown to love it. She had not expected to grow to love anything about this country in the state of mind she'd arrived in, but the sea had gotten to her anyway, the way that large and indifferent things sometimes did, forcing a perspective that had nothing to do with the smallness of human arrangements. "Taejun." "Yes." "I need to tell you something. About what kept me silent for those 3 months." She turned from the window. He was watching her with the full, unguarded attention that she had come to understand was the form his care took. Not declarations, not grand gestures, but the willingness to stop everything and simply look at her when she spoke. "I was afraid that if I broke the peace, I'd lose you. Not because of them. Because of what I thought it would cost you to choose between your family and your wife." She paused. "I didn't trust you to make that choice." He held very still. "I know that now," she said. I know it the way you can only know something after it's already cost you. And I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know that the silence wasn't only about protecting you, it was also about not trusting you. The kitchen was very quiet. You had reasons not to trust me, he said finally. Some of them, she said. Not all of them. Some of them I made up from fear. He stood up from the table and came around to where she was standing, and he did not pull her into anything or reach for her hand. He stood in front of her and looked at her with an expression that was the accumulated weight of 6 months of marriage and 3 months of a particular kind of hell, and the specific grief of understanding what had happened in your own house under your own name. And he said, I'm sorry. Not for tonight. For every day before tonight. She looked at him. At the lines in his face, he was aging. She had noticed it these past months, not badly, but the way that men who carry heavy things age, the weight of it becoming visible in the set of the jaw and the eyes that had stopped expecting rest. I know, she said. She did not say I forgive you. She said I know, which was honest, which was where she actually was. Not at forgiveness yet, but at the beginning of the road toward it. The part where you acknowledge what's true and you choose, with your eyes open, to keep walking. She put her hand flat against his chest. Just that. The gesture of someone checking that a thing is real. He covered it with his own hand and held it there. 6 months later, Amani gave birth in a small private hospital 30 minutes from the coastal house, a facility Tai Jun had chosen specifically because it was not in Seoul, not on any of the Kang organization's known operational territories, not connected to any institution that any of the 3 women in the East Wing or in Jeju or in Tokyo could have predicted or had advanced knowledge of. The labor was long. It was the kind of long that strips everything unnecessary away and leaves a person with only what is fundamental: breath, will, the body doing what it has always known how to do even when the mind is far past exhausted. Taejun stayed through all of it, through the 12 hours, through the moments she didn't want to be touched, and the moments she gripped his hand so hard she felt the bones of his fingers shift, and he did not try to make it smaller or neater than it was. He was simply present, which was, in the end, what she had always needed him to be. The child was born in the blue early light of a February morning, and she was healthy, and she was loud about being here, and she had her father's stillness around the eyes, and her mother's jaw, and a head of dark hair that the nurse exclaimed over, and cheeks that did the thing newborn cheeks do, which is be so outrageously perfect that the sight of them reorders whatever you thought you understood about what mattered. Imani held her before Taejun did. He didn't reach. He waited until she looked up and nodded, and then he took his daughter with the specific carefulness of a man who has spent his life handling things that could be broken and has never been less afraid to break something than he is in this moment. And he held her against his chest and looked at her face and said nothing for a long time. Then he looked at Imani. She has your nose, he said. She has your forehead. I have a good forehead. You do, Imani agreed, and she was smiling, which was something she noted with a separate, quieter part of her mind. The part that had been keeping an unofficial count of the smiles that were real versus the ones that were performed. The part that had watched the ratio shift slowly over the past 6 months. This one was real, entirely real, unmanufactured by any calculation. She reached up and touched the jade pendant at her collarbone. Seo-yeon, Hwa-young, and Soo-jin learned about the birth through an announcement that Tae-jun's attorney sent by formal correspondence to each of their separate addresses. It stated the child's name, her date of birth, and her legal status as heir to the Kang family's legitimate holdings. It was signed by Tae-jun. It did not invite response. None of them attended. None of them were invited. None of them sent anything that Imani saw, and if they sent anything to Tae-jun, he did not bring it to her, and she did not ask. The child's name was Aryam. It meant beautiful in Korean, and Tae-jun had suggested it, and Imani had sat with it for a week, saying it in different contexts, testing whether it fit, and had finally said yes. Her middle name was Dorothy. In the spring, when Aryam was 2 months old and the pine trees outside the coastal house had come back fully green and the sea had shifted into its warmer, more forgiving register, Imani set up a canvas in the sunlit room that faced the water. She hadn't painted since Chicago. She had drawn small things in sketchbooks she bought herself from a shop in the nearest town, drawings of the sea and the trees and the curve of her daughter's ear. But she hadn't painted. She stood in front of the blank canvas for a long time. Then she started. She painted slowly at first, the way you walk again after a long stillness, with attention to each movement, with the slight surprise of finding that the body remembers. Then more easily. Then the way she had always painted when it was going well, without tracking time, without narrating, just the physical fact of color and gesture and the specific conversation between what she intended and what the work became. Tae-jun appeared in the doorway at some point with Aryam in his arms, the baby awake and looking at everything with the comprehensive, unfrightened curiosity of someone who had arrived in the world 4 months ago and had not yet learned to be cautious about it. He looked at what Imani was painting. It was not abstract, it was figurative. A woman standing in a doorway with one hand pressed against the frame. But unlike the painting that had hung in a Chicago gallery on the night they met, the one he had stood in front of for 6 minutes, the one that had been destroyed by his aunt's hands on an estate that felt like another lifetime. This woman was not ambiguous. She was not deciding whether to come in or go out. She was standing in her own doorway, both hands on the frame now, and she was staying. Tae-jun looked at the painting for a long moment. Then he looked at his wife. She had paint on her left hand and her hair was pulled back, and she was wearing one of his old shirts, and she looked like someone who had been through a sustained and genuine difficulty and had come out the other side of it not unmarked. Marked, in fact, permanently, in ways that didn't disappear, but standing. "Is that you?" he asked. She looked at the canvas, at the woman in the doorway. "It's the first painting I've made that belongs here," she said. He looked at her. She looked back at him. Behind them, the sea moved against the rocks the way it always moved, without pause, without needing to be witnessed, the same indifferent and enormous constancy it had always been. And the pine trees held their shape against the coastal wind, and Aryam made a small sound in her father's arms that was not quite a word and not quite a question, but somewhere between the two. Imani turned back to the canvas. She picked up her brush. She kept painting.